Thank you, Miss Weaver. Hello, I am now unmuted. Welcome to Mental Health Monday. Um, I just pulled up Miss Weaver's comment to say hi and welcome back. Glad to have you back again. So today we are going to talk about healthy relationships, and this is going to be part one of a two-part series, which part two is not going to come next week. We're going to wait a little while before we do part two. But the second part is going to be about unhealthy relationships. Pretty obvious what it might be. So today we're just going to talk about healthy relationships, why they're important and to your mental health, and how do you build them and maintain them for mental health purposes. But first, I'm going to remind you that Mental Health Mondays is sponsored by Always Up Coaching, where we give everybody an hour of life coaching for absolutely free. What is life coaching? Make an appointment and you can find out. But basically, we help everybody do the things they want to do out of life. We help them live their best life if we can. But if you're feeling like you're not living your best life, if you have some goals or dreams that, have been niggling away at you, nagging in your ear that you've been wanting to do it and you just haven't had a time yet to just really put the focus on it, we can help you with that too. We can help you with all sorts of things. If you have some mental health concerns that just want to talk to somebody about, you don't feel like you need to see a doctor, but you think you need to do a little something just to prioritize and optimize your mental health, feel free to make an appointment. And if we can't help you in that hour, we'll point you in the right direction. Okay? And take a moment to share. Somebody you may know, just like you value this content, somebody you may know may value this content or need this content even. So go ahead and take a moment to share the stream if you can. I'd appreciate it. And the person who gets the share would as well. So let me arrange my notes on my laptop here so I can see your comments and see my little notes here. Not many notes, but enough to keep me on track here. So why is a healthy relationship important? First, I always like to start off by defining what we're talking about. Hey, Mr. Lee. But a healthy relationship doesn't have a true definition. A healthy relationship is a very individualized definition based on two individuals in the relationship, right? What is a healthy relationship between me and my son? One son, I have three sons, may be different than what a healthy relationship is between me and another son, because one son may have different needs from the relationship than the other son may have. So a healthy relationship is one that just brings positive things to both parties in the relationship. So why is it important for mental health? Well, it's just an essential part of mental health. We need people, right? We need people to maintain our emotional health. So whether it be just somebody just to support us in maintaining well-being, somebody providing social support, emotional connection, someone to help us feel a sense of belonging. All those things are very important for your mental health. And that's the things that healthy relationships can bring you. On the contrary, if relationships are unhealthy, they can have a negative impact on your mental health, obviously. So you can have stuff like increased stress, anxiety, depression. All those things can come along with a strained relationship, a relationship that is unhealthy. So when we're thinking about healthy relationships, there's different types of healthy relationships. So when we talk about healthy relationships, we're talking about the whole gamut of relationships, because it requires some of the same elements for every type of relationship. But some of these types of relationships are romantic relationships, relationships with your family, and within family relationships, you have different types of relationships, right? Like I said before, relationship with a son versus relationship with my mother. Friendships, professional relationships. I have a relationship with all of my coworkers, right? And you could probably throw a few other types of relationships you have with people, but some of the things we talk about today, it doesn't matter what the type of relationship is, they're foundational to any healthy relationship. Each of those types of relationships has its own challenges and benefits as well, right? So based on those challenges and benefits is how you're going to decide if a relationship is healthy or not. So building healthy relationships. To build a healthy relationship, the number one ingredient is communication. Communication is a requirement. You cannot relate with somebody, like relate, unless you're communicating in some form or fashion. Communicating involves active listening. You gotta listen. You gotta not hear, but listen. Listen to understand. That's the difference between hearing and listening. I can hear my dog moan and groan across the room, but I don't understand why he's doing it, right? Because I don't speak dog language, right? But that's the difference between hearing and listening. You don't just need to hear people. You need to listen to them so you can understand what they're trying to communicate. Also, one of the points of communication that's important for building a healthy relationship is expressing your needs and boundaries. You cannot have a healthy relationship unless you feel comfortable communicating those things. And it's also important, communication is important to build trust and intimacy. So communication is at the foundation. You can't build some of those other elements that you need to build and maintain a relationship without communication. There has to be some kind of communication. So an example of active listening would be just paying attention to somebody, like really looking them in their eye and saying, man, I'm really wanting to understand you and I want you to know that I'm listening to you. Look them in their eye. Try to give them those, what do you call it? The nonverbal communication. Those are things we do with our body that indicate certain communication, that communicate certain things, right? So like, if I'm rolling my eyes while somebody's talking to me, that's not indicating that I'm listening to them, right? If I'm looking at my phone doing something else, that may to them not indicate that they're listening, right? And so different people have communication styles, different communication styles. I'm the type of person who sometimes have problems, I'm the type of person who sometimes has a problem looking directly at people while I'm listening to them, mainly because it takes away my focus. I have ADHD. So as I'm looking at them, I'm looking at their eyelashes and how beautiful they are. I'm getting distracted by facial features, right? So part of building a healthy relationship is learning communication styles, right? I remember I had a friend that was like, why are you always doing this or doing that or looking away from me or doing something else when we're having a conversation? I'm just that type of person that I have to be doing more than one thing at a time. That's my listening style. In order to fully listen to you and engage, sometimes I need to do something else. I'm not good at just having that one-on-one communication where I can look you directly in the eye the entire time we're talking. Often, even if I am looking in your eye, I might still be doing something with my hands, right? So that's something that we communicated between one another so we could both understand, and that person could understand where I was coming from. So an example of using communication to express your needs and boundaries includes being clear about what you need from a relationship. You got to communicate your needs, and also what you're willing to accept. And that's where the boundaries come in. I'm okay with XYZ, but I'm not okay with ABC. Being very specific and open about those things, because nobody is a mind reader. Nobody. Some people are very good at guessing what people think, but still, more often than not, they're going to be wrong. So you have to open your mouth and say what you mean. At some point in our series that we do, Mental Health Mondays, we will talk a little bit more about communication in particular, because it's a thing that a lot of us struggle with, and it's something I've struggled with in my life, and I've gotten a whole lot better with. And I still have issues with it, but it takes work, as becoming good at anything does. Communication is one of those things that takes work. So one more point about communication is I spoke about building trust and intimacy. We cannot learn to trust one another unless we are willing to be honest, share information, be consistent in the communication, and be vulnerable with our emotions and thoughts, right? So that's how trust is built. We each give an inch, 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 until we feel on equal playing field as far as the trust goes, right? So let's move on to maintaining healthy relationships, okay? And when it comes to maintaining healthy relationships, of course, some of the same elements of building a relationship is involved. Communication, right? But what typically makes a relationship tip over to unhealthy is um, failures in different ways to do things, right? For example, failure to resolve conflict in a healthy fashion, right? Because if you're not resolving the conflict in a healthy manner, people get injured, right? They get their feelings hurt, they hold grudges, they can't forgive. All those different things start happening when you don't properly resolve a conflict. Conflict is a normal, healthy thing in any relationship. You're going to argue, but you want to argue in a healthy fashion. There's going to, people's tones of voice are going to change if they're passionate about things, if they care about things. You're talking about something that's important, an argument may ensue, but it's in the resolution of the argument in which that argument is healthy, right? So when you resolve conflicts, it involves things such as compromising. You can't always have your way. In the real world, you cannot always have your way. It's not Burger King. It's not have it your way. It's having your way some of the time, right? So you got to be able to compromise with people, and that's where your boundaries come in. You have the things that you're not willing to move on, right? Those are your boundaries, and that's your limits of what you're willing to accept. And you have everything else should be flexible based on the needs of the other person in the relationship and the desire and the boundaries of the other person in the relationship. Correct? Right? So you need to be able to compromise. The next thing you need to do to resolve conflict in a healthy manner is you need to be able to empathize, right? So empathize involves, in simple terms, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. That's a very important skill. And for some people, it takes more practice than others. Some people aren't natural for empathizing because their personality developed in a context in which they were always anticipating what other people were feeling and worrying about what people were feeling. Sometimes being good at empathy sometimes comes from trauma, believe it or not. But some people are just natural. Some people develop it from life experiences, and some people actively work to build their empathy, right? So it's something that if you feel you struggle with empathy and the ability to see things from other people's point of view and actually understand emotions from their point of view, that is something you need to work on if you want to have healthy relationships. And the third element of resolving conflicts in a healthy manner is active listening, right? So in order to be able to empathize and compromise, you got to listen to what the other person is saying and work to understand what they are saying, right? Because if you can't listen and understand, you can't reach a compromise because you don't know what they're saying, what they need. It's not clear to you what the issue is, right? You got to be very clear on what the issue is in order to establish a compromise. So sometimes in relationships, you can develop what's called a codependency. And a lot of people have heard this in the context of substance abuse, but it's not just exclusively something that is seen in substance abuse alone. So what is codependency? Codependency is when one person becomes overly reliant on the other for emotional support and validation. And what happens, with codependency, it becomes a lopsided relationship. One person is having their needs being met, they're being supportive, and the other person is not. Basically, one person is siphoning resources and the other person is receiving nothing in return. It's a one-way direction, and relationship needs to be two-way, right? Needs to be a give and take. So if you are in a codependent relationship, that's something you probably need to get out of. And I know that's easier said than done, but very often in that relationship, the other person has to realize that they are broken in some way, that they have these extreme needs that can only be served by you, right? And if they cannot realize that their own emotional self-support system and their ability to support other people is broken, right? They don't have the ability to support themselves, and therefore not the ability to support the other person, right? Emotionally. If they can't realize that they don't have that ability, then they can't seek help. But if they can't seek help, you're between a rock and a hard place. So if you find yourself in that type of relationship, and that is the case where that other person does not realize how much they take and how much they don't give, you need to move on. You need to protect yourself, right? Sometimes maintaining healthy relationships means ending relationships, right? Because there's no way for it to become healthy if that one codependent person is leeching from you and is not re-supporting you back emotionally, right? So it's very important to be able to recognize when that is happening in a relationship and to attempt to communicate with that person and explain to them what is happening and the fact that you are giving all the support and not receiving support. And if they push back on that, you're going to just have to say, hey, you need to go to counseling, and then maybe we need to go to relationship counseling, so to help you see what I see, and maybe to help have a third party come into this relationship and be objective and tell you what that third party sees, right? I.e. a counselor. It could be a friend or pastor, whatever your comfort level is, but it needs to be a very objective individual when it comes to talking to both of you. So how do you know when to let go of a relationship? So knowing when to let go of a relationship is a very important aspect of maintaining mental health, because very often in relationships, particularly with family and significant others, we don't want to let go. We love that person, right? We love the family member, we love the friend, we love the significant other. We don't want to let go. There usually has been a history of some positive things in the relationship, right? But at the point we realize that the relationship has shifted to one that's toxic or abusive, you may need to end the relationship if that other person is not willing to work on themselves. Because that's the thing. A lot of times in toxic or abusive relationships or codependent relationship, that other person needs to have an awareness and an acceptance that they need to do something, right? And if they can't reach that point, the relationship needs to come to an end, or there will be no growth, there will be no mending of the relationship. It will just remain an unhealthy relationship, and that's at the point that you realize you have to let go. So when do you let go? When anytime a relationship is no longer serving your needs after you even tried to put in work to make your needs be known, right? So you make your needs be known in a relationship, whether it be friend, family member, significant other, and maybe you give them another chance. You communicate a second time or third time, but depending on the person, one time should be enough. But with anybody, three times is more than enough, right? So after the third time of you being very clear and communicating what your needs are, that may be the moment. That is the moment that you need to move on. And later, when we, in the next episode, when we talk about unhealthy relationships, we'll go into more of how you manage to let go, right? How do you manage to because it can be very difficult, specifically in more toxic and abusive relationships, more so than just a generally unhealthy relationship, to get away, right? So we'll talk more about that when we talk about unhealthy relationships in another episode. So now we talked about a little bit about building, a little bit about maintaining. Now we're going to go a little bit deeper into communication and talk about some very specific skills that we hadn't talked about yet. We did talk about active listening, right? But we're going to talk about a few more skills that you need for communication in order to maintain a healthy relationship. So one of the things that is essential is effective communication. Effective communication means you're actually successful in translating what you're saying to the other person, and they're giving you feedback that they did listen and they do understand. That is how you know something is effective. And the thing about effective communication, it's something that's needed, but there's no specific way to be effective in your communication. It's going to vary from person to person. Different people who are receiving the communication are going to have different needs in order to have that communication be effective, right? So it takes a lot of trial and error for people sometimes to find that perfect way or effective way to communicate with another individual, right? But one thing for sure is that effective communication involves active listening, always, right? But it also involves two other skills we're going to talk about, which is assertiveness and nonviolent communication. So assertiveness means expressing your needs and boundaries in a clear and respectful way, while at the same time avoiding passive and aggressive communication styles, right? Because those types of communication styles confuse people, right? Because it involves a lot of nonverbal subtext. So I think most people know what passive aggressiveness is. But let me give you an example for somebody who may not be clear what passive aggressiveness is. Passive aggressiveness is when somebody critiques you, but they ended up with, well, that's okay, chuckle, chuckle, chuckle. They say something very critical of you, but they ended with, they say it with a smile and they ended with a laugh, almost as if, oh, I was just joking, but they actually meant it, right? So that context of, the expression on the face and the maybe the giggle at the end may bring confusion, like, is she joking or does she really mean it? And that actually makes you less assertive whenever you communicate in that way, right? So that's passive aggressiveness. If you're going to be that way, you're not being assertive, right? Because first of all, it's going to confuse some people. Some people are going to know exactly what you're saying, but they're going to ignore it because of the passive aggressiveness in the way you deliver the message. And then aggressive communication, that's pretty obvious, Now, I'm not going to say it's completely obvious. Sometimes aggressive is a very subjective term. Aggressiveness is in the perceiver, right? So I can say something in a different tone, and if somebody's not familiar with my tones, they can perceive my tone as aggressive. But maybe my tone was just passionate in my mind, right? It was just passionate, not aggressive at all. So that is something you need to be wary of. When you're delivering the piece of information, is that person, what is their expression on their face? If they're perceiving you as aggressive, they may immediately respond back in aggressive tone to you, right? What you perceive as aggressive. So that means they perceived your tone as aggressive, right? Or if you said something that wasn't meant to be an aggressive statement and they respond aggressively, maybe there's something about the way you said that statement that, they took affront to, right? So we need to be very mindful when we are communicating effectively, and in order to communicate effectively, to pay attention to who we are communicating to, and read the subtle cues they may be giving us about how they're receiving us, right? Are they rolling their eyes when we're talking to them? Is their expression, is their flat expression turning into a frown, right? Is, their previously flat expression turning into a smirk? Those are the cues we need to pick up on when we're communicating that may indicate that someone is receiving our communication in an aggressive fashion, right? But then there's the overt aggressiveness, in which, very loud, angry tones that are very obvious to everybody are loud and angry, right? So we need to avoid those types of styles when we're trying to be effective in our communication. So another example, as we said, of the type of things to avoid in order to be effective is we want to avoid violent communication, which means we want to use nonviolent communication. And using nonviolent communication means using I statements to express how you feel, right? You don't want to, if you're trying to communicate something that's wrong, you don't want to turn it on the person, which may cause the person to become defensive. So you want to be very careful to say how you feel, right? I feel this, and you want to avoid any type of blame, any type of criticism, and you want to be proactive in your conversation and focusing on coming to that solution or the compromise in the communication. So, and this is in particular when conflict arises. We're talking about these communication styles are more so problematic, right? So an example of this in a conversation would be, instead of saying, "You never listen to me," you want to say something like, "I feel unheard when I try to share my feelings with you." So let them know how you're feeling and the outcome of them never listening to you, instead of saying, "You never listen to me." Telling them what they're doing wrong is not enough. And it often is met with a little bit of defensiveness. So just to use myself as an example, and I'm backing up to assertiveness right now. Sorry, y'all. I was not a very assertive person. I tended to talk in very low tones with people in general. So very sometimes very flat tones. Particularly people that I didn't have well established relationships with. And often I failed to communicate, period, right? So I couldn't be effective in my communication if I just chose not to communicate, right? So that was failing to communicate is a lack of assertiveness, right? Opening your mouth is the first step of being assertive. But I also at times would be a little passive aggressive with people. When I did start to communicate my needs, instead of being very direct with it, sometimes, and particularly for my case, it was with significant others, I was very more so direct with like friends, I was more direct with other people, but because you're so tied to that relationship with the significant other, you want to be very gentle about delivering things sometimes, that it comes across as less assertive and nothing happens with what you said. Even though they may have understood what you said, they don't take it seriously. So I had to develop the ability to be assertive by repeating myself, being very clear, looking in the eye, which is something that I had trouble with before, managing my tone appropriately, and being very firm and repeating stuff over and over again. And, that helped me become more assertive. And that's how I started being more assertive, by just repetition. I just kept saying it till they had to pay attention, right? That is a mechanism of assertiveness. Not letting things go is a way of being assertive. If you're letting things go easily, that's not assertive. So, boundaries. Boundaries are so important in healthy relationships. They're required in healthy relationships, and they're required more so to be clear, which means you need to, first of all, understand what your own boundaries are. A lot of people don't know what their boundaries are. So that's where that self-care, self-reflection comes in, and if you don't know what your boundaries are, discovering what they are, right? Unfortunately, a lot of times we discover our boundaries through bad experiences, right? We get hurt, and that's how we know our boundaries. Or we get embarrassed, right? Or somebody reveals something we don't want the general public to know. So hopefully you can discover most of your boundaries without bad situations happening, but sometimes that's how you know, right? So be sure to, and this is where journaling comes in, right? When bad things happen, when you feel hurt, embarrassed, or whatever, examine the situation to determine if there was a boundary violation. And that's where this thing, conflict or whatever, it was at the root of that conflict or whatever. There was a violations of boundaries. Also, examine certain situations, maybe reflect, journal, whatever, in that if someone else is upset or hurt and you feel you're the cause, consider maybe you violated a boundary of somebody, and maybe they don't even know what their boundaries are at this point, but that's something to maybe discuss later with that person to help resolve that boundary. I mean, to help resolve that conflict and establish a new means of a new communication contract, so to speak, because now you know that that is a boundary, right? So personal boundaries can include physical boundaries, they can include emotional boundaries, and they can include intellectual boundaries. So it could include a lot of things. So that's why it's so important to self-reflect and remember and know. And when we feel violated in some way, you know, feeling violated is a specific emotion, right? So if you're feeling violated, examine what boundary was crossed and make note of it. So, as you communicate with the person you're in a relationship, you can communicate that this is a boundary for me. Often boundaries are defined by our triggers. Sometimes we talked about triggers in previous episodes, and we also talked on Self-Care Saturday about triggers. If you know your triggers, often your triggers help you define what your boundaries are. So, consistent violation of your boundaries by somebody after you've clearly communicated them to that person can be an indication that you are in an unhealthy relationship. So that's why it's so important to communicate your boundaries, because sometimes we don't when we're in something, sometimes we can't see clearly, right? So if our boundaries are being consistently violated, even after they've been very clearly and effectively communicated, that could be a sign that you may be in an abusive relationship. We know that not all abusive relationships involve physical abuse, right? So there's emotional abuse and psychological abuse. So take a moment when you recognize a trend or a pattern in someone violating your boundaries to evaluate whether you may be either the object of someone's abuse or in a codependent or toxic relationship. So part of being able to set and maintain those healthy boundaries is, practicing self-care, as I said, journaling, you know, breaking down those emotions that you're feeling and being able to debrief after conflict and identifying those boundaries. That's part of self-care. But also, you got to practice that assertiveness, and you got to respect the boundaries of others. One indication if your boundaries are being violated a lot, also take a little bit of self reflection and say, and ask yourself, is this person repetitively violating my boundaries because I'm repetitively violating? Is it a retaliation for me violating their boundaries, right? So just be aware of that you need to be cautious to respect others' boundaries as well. So let's talk a little bit about trust and intimacy. So as we said, trust is an important element in establishing and maintaining healthy relationships. Trust and intimacy involves being honest, reliable, and emotionally open. You got to be able to be a little bit vulnerable, as we said earlier. Um, people often forget that trust also involves being consistent with people, showing up. You can show yourself be reliable, but by always showing up. And showing up in healthy relationships sometimes means showing up to the conversation, not running away from conflict and the arguments. Um, being reliable when it comes to, I have something going on that I need emotional support for. You need to show up and be there for that emotional support, or even physical support sometimes, but depending on the nature of the relationship. When I get sick, I need to rely on you to take care of me. That's how we establish trust, and vice versa. So that's, depending on the level of the relationship, that can go to all those different levels of intimacy: emotional, physical, privacy. All those privacy, and privacy not just like, I let you see me naked. Privacy is also, I've been vulnerable and exposed to you my financial information, right? That is, things that we have to expose, and it's a give and take in order to establish trust. So other strategies to increase intimacy other than vulnerability is emotional openness, which is a type of vulnerability. Being exposing yourself and being open with people is a type of vulnerability. And physical touch. That's another type of another strategy to become more intimate with someone. And typically when people hear intimate, they think about sexual intimacy, but intimacy can be something more than that. It could be emotional intimacy, right? And sometimes even establishing emotional intimacy with a friend, like somebody who's platonic, like your best friend or whatever, involves being able to hug them, having the ability to hug them, right? It involves, maybe, comforting them and rubbing them on their back when they're grieving a situation or whatever. It involves those types of things. So it's not always, intimacy is something more than that experience between a couple, right? It's so much more than that. And very often people have trouble building healthy friendships and maintaining healthy friendships because they never can establish trust and intimacy because they are not willing to be vulnerable and open with that other person. So food for thought, something to think about going forward. If you're the type of person who says, man, I think I have trouble making friends, right? Or I think I have trouble keeping friends, Are you violating boundaries? Are you taking time and doing the work to establish trust and intimacy, right? And if you're doing all the work to establish these things, or am I in a toxic or codependent relationship? Am I being abused emotionally or psychologically? Those are the things you need to be thinking about when it comes to building and maintaining healthy relationships. So I got like 6 more bullet points, well, 5 more. Let's see which ones we're going to touch on here. Let's talk about respecting differences, because some of these other things we are going to touch about in unhealthy relationships. Because some of the things I had on here, just because you're wondering what I'm seeing on as these bullet points, I have conflict resolution, recognizing red flags in relationships, self-care in relationships, respecting differences, and recognizing unhealthy patterns and maintaining healthy boundaries. And some of this stuff has overlapped. So I am going to go straight to respecting differences, right? Because that's another big issue people have when they're in relationships that makes it hard for them to build a healthy relationship and maintain them because they lack respect for the differences. There's a lack of mutual respect of differences, right? Very often, in situations like this, there's one person who has respect and the other person doesn't. Usually it's not two people that completely disrespect one another, although that can be. Usually there's one person that lacks a little respect, and some of that lack of respect comes from lack of empathy. So, and lack of understanding, lack of failure to listen and understand. And a lot of respecting of differences comes with understanding the why behind things, right? So it's important to, amongst your relationships, respect and celebrate any differences that exist. And you want to promote a culture of inclusivity where people feel included, right? You know, having have been in the workplace for all of my adult life, I do know when I see people unable to establish healthy relationships, as I look back when people have had conflict and just never got along. One of the things that existed was some one of the two people, if not both, they were different. Those two people were very different. And instead of embracing the differences, they wanted to push back against the differences, right? And that's where the conflict would arise and the inability to establish healthy discord would come in, right? So you got to be able to celebrate people's differences and learn to value differences. Like, I'm that person, like when I meet somebody who's had some kind of different experiences in life or in general, um, I ask questions because I'm curious by nature, right? That's me. I'm curious by nature. So I'm going to ask questions about why they do something differently. And, using the same workplace example, there's more than one way to skin a cat, when it comes to doing certain things in the world, right? So sometimes we do it this way and we think it's the best way, right? Because it's the best way for us, right? But sometimes conflict comes because somebody does something differently, right? So instead of, telling them they're doing it the wrong way, ask them, right? And listen to why that person does it that way, right? And you may learn a new way to do the thing you do, right? And it may be better than your way. But in order to do that, you got to respect that differences exist and that differences are not negative. It's how God made us. He made us all different. We think differently. We talk differently. We experience events differently. We understand differently. And that's what makes this world so diverse. And that's what makes it a good place to live. But if we can't always embrace differences amongst people, amongst the people that are in our circles, amongst people we have to have relationships with, we're not going to be happy, right? So learn to respect and embrace differences and learn when other people are not respecting the differences in you, right? If they don't respect the differences you have, they don't ever respect their opinions. And I'm using workplace because it's such an easy example. You're always offering very good suggestions and they never want to hear your way of doing it, right? Or they always hear it, but they don't listen to it and they shoot it down before even asking you questions to fully understand why you do the thing the way you do. If you're in an environment in which you're not being respected, or in a relationship which you're not being respected, environment, I say usually it's more than one person in your workplace that may be treating you that way. It's time to move on. That is a toxic relationship. You have multiple toxic relationships at your workplace. You don't need to be there. Same thing if it's like your leader, if your leader just doesn't respect your differences, it's time to move on. It's time to move on. That is not a healthy relationship. Same thing with individual relationships, friendships, right? If you invite a friend over to dinner and every time you invite that friend over to dinner, they're always talking about what you serve, right? Because, maybe you're different cultures, right? And they're complaining or whatever. They're not even willing to try the dish you made, right? That is not a healthy relationship, so that this would qualify as a red flag when someone is not embracing something about you that's very different. So that may be an indicator that you need to move on. Obviously, if you value the friendship, communicate, what you're feeling effectively and what you perceive as happening effectively. I feel as if you are not respecting my boundaries, or I feel sad when you criticize the dishes I prepare for you when you come over to eat. You know, I would like you to at least try it. I feel as if you're not respecting my differences, in the culture I was raised as opposed to yours. When you don't even want to try it, I come over to your house and I respect your culture and how you cook, and I eat your food. I want the same, right? So be effectively communicating what you need and that your need is not being met is important. But if they continue to disrespect the things about you, that make you special, it's an unhealthy relationship and it's time to move on. So let's talk a little bit about, let's see, we got about 10 more minutes. So let's talk about recognizing unhealthy relationship patterns. So unhealthy relationship patterns such as codependency, as we spoke about earlier, enabling bad behavior, a pattern of toxic communication, all those things that you can recognize as patterns have a negative impact on your mental health. Even if you've gotten used to it and you can't really put your finger on anything, it's going to have over time a negative impact on your mental health and general well-being, because what's going on mentally can also affect your physical, right? It can also affect your performance at work. It can also affect how you show up for your children. So being able to recognize those unhealthy patterns is important, because we need to, we've been having a running theme in Self-Care Saturday and Mental Health Monday about being able to pull the piece of glass out your foot, right? Recognizing that pattern is saying, ooh, my foot hurts. Let me check and see what's going on. Let me pull the glass out of my foot, right? So being able to recognize those patterns is important in that process, right? So any pattern that you recognize, and those I gave you just now are examples, but any pattern that is perceived as harmful is harmful, or is dysfunctional, something that is impairing the function of the relationship, can be an unhealthy relationship pattern. So, for example, recognizing that a relationship has become toxic or abusive might involve acknowledging a pattern of control from a significant other. So noticing a pattern of this person always needs to control me, or they're always trying to manipulate what I do. They're sowing little seeds here and there that's trying to change what I do. That is a pattern that you can recognize that may indicate that you are in an abusive relationship. So how do we address those unhealthy patterns, right? How do we do it? So first of all, sometimes an unhealthy pattern that's being directed at us is because we don't have a healthy pattern to protect ourselves from that thing, right? And that's things like assertive communication, right? Well, the minute somebody does something controlling, you're assertive and you establish a boundary, right? I'm using me as an example. I'm the type of person who is extremely independent. And anytime my independence someone attempts to take my independence away from me, someone who I don't already have an established relationship with, somebody who I'm still in that building phase with, tries to take away my independence and tries to, assert control over me, I get very defensive, right? And there's been many people that have attempted to date me, and the first sign of control, toxic control, not just a control like offering to do things, but taking over without permission, crossing a line without permission, telling me what to do instead of asking me about something. The minute I see those patterns, I'm gone. I'm out. I'm not even trying to communicate what you did wrong, because I know in the past that that's been a problem I've had in previous unhealthy relationships, because I have a history of being a very easygoing, passive person, and I lacked assertiveness in my past. That was something that I struggled with, being around people who wanted to control me. Now, when I see that, right, I immediately jump on it, right? I'm able to recognize it, right? So part of being able to recognize and address those patterns, being able to recognize and address patterns within ourselves, right? So I had to recognize and address that I was not a good communicator. I was not communicating my needs. I was not being assertive or clear about my needs. That was part of me being able to break my pattern of entering relationships in which people tried to exert patterns of that such, against me, right? Control, etc. So self-reflection, even when it's somebody else doing something to you, you still need to take that moment to reflect on what you need to do and what may not be going on within yourself that's making you vulnerable to that toxic pattern, whatever it may be. So just to summarize it, we all have relationships that we heavily value, the relationships with our family members, the relationships with our significant others, the relationships with our children, the relationships with our close friends. No healthy relationship is maintained without effort. Now, I say effort and I don't say work, because work involved, it should not be that hard, right? If it's that hard to maintain a healthy relationship with somebody, it's often because you're the only one working, right? So it should involve effort, but not extreme effort, right? So just be aware of that, right? So just to review, we got to maintain healthy boundaries. Healthy boundaries are so important to protect ourselves and maintain a healthy relationship, because what makes relationships often become unhealthy is the injury that comes from violations of boundaries, right? We have to be assertive and communicate, and we got to communicate effectively. We have to, part of us communicating effectively is actively listening to that other person. In order to maintain a healthy boundary, we have to be able to recognize when boundaries have been violated, right? And immediately address it and communicate effectively that the boundary was violated, Or else they're going to keep violating that boundary and things are just going to get worse, right? And last but not least, the two major things in this conversation are we have to work on our communication skills too. And we have to be very self-aware of where we lack in communication, but also what we need to build. Not only about what we lack, but what we need to build. And we need to work on it, right? And on the other end of the spectrum, you need to be mindful of your boundaries. You need to establish those boundaries, journal, do whatever you got to do to work on defining your boundaries and knowing how to using those communication skills to communicate them clearly. Those are the two major things in this conversation, because we cannot healthily relate to someone else unless we have these skills to healthily relate to them. They cannot healthily, we can't expect that other person to start doing things, start changing, start, doing all the things we want them to do until we first look at ourselves, right? Very often when a relationship is unhealthy, we seek to blame. But first we need to seek to go inside of ourselves and think about what we can do first, right? And, oftentimes we may come out of that self-reflection saying that, hey, I've been doing all the right things and it is this person. And now you know what you need to do. You need to clearly communicate what's not happening and that your needs aren't being met, right? So start with yourself first before you start with the other person, right? And for people who have extreme difficulty communicating in relationships, especially if you're trying to build a relationship and establish boundaries, what I did a lot before I could really fully verbally communicate a lot of things is I wrote letters. I wrote long text messages, I wrote emails, because that gave me a time to sit down and think and reflect and carefully choose my words. Because a lot of times, when you're trying to build a relationship and make it stronger and more healthy, you don't want to cause injury trying to communicate your needs, right? You don't want to cause injury, have that other person get defensive or have their feelings get hurt, right? So writing things, whether it be, digitally or on paper, can give you that moment to reflect and choose your words carefully, right? And be thorough and complete, right? And some of the relationships that I broke off earlier in my young adult life involved me writing, because I can't verbally, I couldn't do it. I just couldn't. So I had to write. And there's nothing more clear than a letter, right? Because even after you've written that letter, when you need to repeat what you need again, and you're not able to verbalize it, say, I need you to go back and read that letter, please. I just need you to read it. Or let me read it to you. That was the next step for me. I would show up to the conversation with my notes, I've some of the people I've coached say that seems so cheesy or silly. And I said, well, it would be cheesy or silly if you fail to communicate effectively. And if notes is what it takes for you to communicate effectively with that other person, notes is what it's going to be. So I would show up with notes. I would pull out my little, piece of paper or my phone if I put it in my notes app. And I was like, and I would read directly off my notes. I had no shame, right? I had no shame and that's what you call vulnerability, right? I was being vulnerable enough to know that, like, I'm having trouble communicating with you. So I'm showing up with my notes. I don't care what you think about me because I care about this relationship and I'm willing to do what it takes to an extent. So I'm showing up with notes so I can make sure I'm clearly communicating it and communicating it in the appropriate manner to you. So if you're struggling, that's 2 tips: writing and showing up to the conversation with notes. So on that note, I'm gonna end today's discussion on Mental Health Monday. Once again, thank y'all for watching. I want to remind y'all, if you are struggling with establishing healthy relationships, that having a coach is something that can help you, right? Sometimes we do need help. Sometimes we don't have that friend that's good at communicating that can help us, right? And having a coach can help you with that. So just so you know, and just to remind you that everybody gets free hour of life coaching, right? So don't hesitate to go to alwaysupcoaching.com and click book a free discovery call, right? And I'm going to send you a packet of information in which you can give me a lot of background information about yourself. So when we meet on Zoom, because that's how we do it, we do our appointments via Zoom. We've already got a lot of our time covered, right? And we can spend that whole hour clarifying what the problems or issues are, and defining what the true needs are, and establishing some goals and making plans, right? So that's what happens when you book that appointment. So don't hesitate, book the appointment. I'm very liberal with my appointment, the time windows I leave open for free appointments. So there's no doubt in my mind that if you want to make an appointment, you'll find a time that's convenient for you. Okay, so that's our mission. We're here to help y'all. Okay, so until Saturday, on Self-Care Saturday, in which we'll talk about taking care of your intellectual self, I hope y'all have a wonderful week. Remember to take care of you, perform self-care, journal, plan, do all those good, healthy habits that help you live your best life. Okay? Happy Monday. Have a great week, y'all. Goodbye.